There is a specific kind of pain that doesn't announce itself. It doesn't arrive with the drama you were prepared for. No raised voices. No slammed doors. No moment where someone looks at you with something ugly enough to justify what happens next. It arrives quietly, in the middle of a Thursday evening, over a dinner you made. And the reason it takes so long to understand, the reason you spend months turning it over like something you found at the bottom of a drawer that you can't identify but can't throw away, is that the person holding the knife looked, from the outside, exactly like someone who loved you. That's what this story is about, not the ending. The ending is the easy part. This is about the 14 months before the ending, about what it means to be genuinely held by someone who may not have been entirely there, about the specific confusion of a relationship that doesn't fit the template for bad relationships, and what happens to you when the pain comes anyway and you have no framework to put it in. If you've ever sat with a version of this, if you've ever found yourself unable to explain to someone why something hurts so much when, from the outside, nothing that terrible seemed to happen, this story is for you. Her name is Karina, 31, contracts administrator, Portland, Oregon. She is the kind of person who reads the fine print, not because she's anxious, but because she's genuinely curious about what people think they can conceal in small font. She has two close friends. She has told each of them a different half of this story, because the full version requires context she hasn't yet found the language for. The man's name is Broderick, 34, operations manager at a craft brewery, charming in a way that, if you looked at it carefully, had a specific architecture to it. The laugh arrived a half-beat too readily. The eye contact held a fraction too long. Karina noticed this the first night she met him, at a friend's dinner party, 18 months before everything ended, and she mentioned it on the drive home. Her friend said she was being uncharitable. Karina filed it, moved on. They became a couple 6 weeks later. Not because she stopped noticing the performance. She never entirely stopped. But because she started to believe, and this is the part that matters, that she was the only person he wasn't performing for. He told her things, early on, that he said he'd never told anyone. About his father. About a version of himself that existed before he learned how to be the version other people found easy. She believed him. She sat across from him at a small table in a restaurant that smelled like wood smoke and rosemary, and she thought, this is what it feels like when someone actually lets you in. She still isn't entirely sure she was wrong. That's the first thing you need to hold on to as this story unfolds. Not that she was naive. Not that she missed something obvious. But that what she encountered was, in certain specific and important ways, real. The warmth was real. The attentiveness was real. The sense of being known, of having someone track the details of your life not because they were performing interest, but because they were genuinely interested. That was real. And that reality is precisely what makes the rest of this so difficult to understand. For 14 months, the relationship functioned. They traveled twice. Once to a coastal town in Northern California where they ate bad seafood and laughed about it for the rest of the trip. Once to visit her family in Minnesota where her father, who likes almost no one, found Broderick easy to talk to. That surprised her. She mentioned it to Broderick afterward. He smiled and said her father just needed someone who wasn't afraid of his silences. She thought about that for a long time. They argued, not destructively, the kind of arguments that end with both people understanding the other slightly better than they did before. She introduced him to her two closest friends separately because the logistics never aligned, and both friends said, privately and unprompted, that he seemed good for her. He was present for the hard things. When her mother had a health scare, nothing serious in the end, but a terrifying 10 days before anyone knew that, Broderick drove 4 hours without being asked. He sat with her in hospital waiting rooms and didn't once make her feel like his patience had a limit. When she lost a major project at work and spent an entire weekend in a low-grade fog of inadequacy, he didn't try to fix it. He sat with her in it. He knew the difference between someone who needs solutions and someone who needs company. She trusted him with the versions of herself that weren't put together. That's not nothing. Most people never receive those versions. Most people never earn them. Before I go further, I want to name something. Because there's a version of this story where you're waiting for the reveal. The thing he was hiding. The other person. The secret life. The financial deception. Something that would organize everything into a comprehensible narrative with a clear villain. I need to tell you now, that version of this story doesn't exist. What happened here is harder than that, and harder to explain, and harder, in some ways, to recover from. Because the templates we have for relationships that end badly, the ones we've inherited from the internet and the advice columns, and the friends who've been through their own versions of this, they all require a villain who is visibly doing something wrong. Someone who isolates you. Someone who controls you. Someone whose behavior, mapped against a list, produces a clear diagnosis. Broderick's behavior didn't map onto any list Karina knew. And that gap, the gap between the pain she felt and the absence of a template that could explain it, is what this story is actually about. Let me explain something before we go further. There's a concept in psychology called selective presence. It doesn't have an official clinical name, but anyone who has experienced it will recognize it immediately when it's described. Selective presence is not the same as emotional unavailability in the way that term is usually used. An emotionally unavailable person is consistently absent. You can feel the wall, you can map its edges, you know where the warmth ends and the distance begins. That consistency, paradoxically, gives you something to orient to. Selective presence is different. The person is fully, genuinely there for you during certain kinds of difficulty. Crisis ready, attuned to specific frequencies of need. And then, when a different kind of need arises, when the need involves them rather than you, when what is required is not comfort but accountability, they recede. Not dramatically. There's no fight, no shutdown, no coldness you can point to. They simply become harder to locate emotionally. The warmth goes ambient, diffuse, present enough that you can still feel it if you reach for it, but no longer landing the way it did. The modern analogy that keeps coming to mind is this. Imagine a radio that picks up certain frequencies with perfect clarity and others not at all. You don't think of it as a broken radio. You think of it as a radio with a strong signal on the channels you've been listening to. The channels it can't receive seem like a minor limitation until you need one of them. The reason this matters in Karina's story is that she noticed the recession. She tracked it. She was precise enough and self-aware enough to register that something shifted when she expressed needs that had anything to do with him, with the relationship, with the dynamic between them, with the question of whether they were building towards something or simply continuing. She noticed, and she interpreted it as a communication style difference, not as information about the fundamental architecture of what they were in. That reinterpretation, the move from this is information to this is just how he is something I want to stay with for a moment, because it's not a failure of intelligence. Karina is not someone who misses things, and it's not a failure of self-respect. She wasn't desperate or dependent or lacking in an accurate sense of her own worth. It was something more specific. When someone has given you enough genuine evidence of care, when they've driven 4 hours without being asked, when they've sat with you in the fog without trying to fix it, when they've made your father feel heard, you build a model of them based on that evidence. You construct a picture of who they are from the data points they've offered. And that model, once built, has weight. It doesn't dissolve easily when the data gets complicated. It demands more data. It asks you to account for the new information within the existing framework rather than replace the framework. This is not foolishness. It is, in fact, how trust works. How it's supposed to work. The problem is that the model Karina built was accurate for some of Broderick, for the part of him that was genuinely capable of care, genuinely capable of attention and presence in the dimensions where he'd practiced those things. It was not accurate for all of him. And she didn't know, couldn't have known, from the data she had, that there were dimensions of him that the model had never encountered. If you're half listening to this while doing something else, I need you to actually look at the screen for this next part. Because this is where the story stops being about Karina and Broderick and starts being about something you've probably felt in your own life. The moment I want you to understand, the one I keep returning to, the one that I think is the real center of gravity in this story. It happened on a Thursday evening in March. 14 months in, Karina had made dinner. Something she'd made before, something he'd said he liked. The apartment was warm. There was nothing wrong with the evening from the outside. During the meal, she said something she'd been turning over for 2 weeks. She said, and she'd chosen the words carefully, because she is someone who chooses words carefully, that she felt, sometimes, like she was doing most of the relational labor. Not as an accusation. She was explicit about that, in the way she said it. This wasn't a fight she was starting. It was an observation she wanted to share with someone she trusted. She wanted him to know she was noticing something. She wanted to find out if he was noticing it too. What happened next is the thing she has been trying to make sense of for 8 months. He didn't get angry. He didn't defend himself. He didn't reach across the table and say she was wrong or right, or that they should talk about it more, or that he'd been feeling something similar and was glad she'd brought it up. He looked at her. She describes it as a very still moment. Like the room changed quality. Like the temperature didn't drop, but she became aware of the temperature. And then he said, quietly, carefully, in the voice of someone who had been sitting with something for a while, that he wasn't sure he had ever actually been in love with her. That he thought he had been, when it started, but that he wasn't certain the feeling had been real, or whether he had wanted it to be real and had mistaken the wanting for the thing itself. He said it gently. He said it the way someone says something they have rehearsed. Not coldly. Rehearsed in the way that people rehearse things they know will cause damage and want to cause as little as possible. Then he stood up, thanked her for dinner, and left. She remembers the thanking her for dinner. She's mentioned it to both of her friends. Neither of them knew what to do with it either. There's something about that detail, the social grace, the politeness, the small act of consideration in the middle of the thing that just happened. That is, in its own way, the most disorienting part of the entire evening. Because it meant he was still himself. Still the person who noticed things, who was considerate, who tracked the small gestures of care that most people miss. Even then, even in that moment, the knife was still held the same way. She just hadn't seen the knife until then. He came back for his things 11 days later. She was at work. He had a key. He left it on the counter. There was no note. She doesn't know if the absence of a note was a kindness or a cruelty or neither. She spent several days trying to determine which and eventually concluded that the question itself might be the wrong question. That she was trying to assign intention to something that might have simply been a person not knowing what to say and choosing the silence over the inadequacy of words. She's not sure that conclusion is right either. For the first month, the grief was legible. She knew what it was. She had lost a relationship she had believed in and a person she had trusted and a future she had been, without quite articulating it, building toward. The loss was real and she felt it as a real loss, and she let herself feel it. It was the second month that got complicated, because by the second month, the grief started to develop a second layer. Not deeper grief, something different. Something that felt less like sadness and more like a problem she couldn't solve. The problem was this. She couldn't locate the lie. She had gone back through 14 months of memory looking for the moment where it became clear that something was false, and she couldn't find it. Not because she was protecting the memory of him. She had no investment in protecting him by that point. But because the evidence genuinely didn't resolve into a clean story about deception. The warmth had been real. The care had been real. The attention had been real. Even, she now thought, the vulnerability, the things he'd said he'd never told anyone, had probably been real, in the sense that he'd meant them when he said them. What wasn't real, or what she couldn't confirm had been real, was the conclusion she'd drawn from all of it. The model she'd built. The picture of a person who was, at some fundamental level, in this with her. This is where I want to introduce something that I think is the hardest idea in this story. And I want to be honest that I'm not sure I have it fully worked out. But I've been sitting with it long enough that I think it's worth saying. There is a difference between someone who lies to you and someone who is, in a deep sense, not entirely present in their own life. A person who lies to you makes a choice. There is a self doing the lying, a self that knows what is true and selects something different. The deception has an author, which means the relationship has a specific kind of meaning. It was something real to you and something performed by them. But a person who is not entirely present in their own life is different. They are not performing. Or rather, they are performing, but not in the way that implies a separate self backstage who knows the truth. The performance is the only self they have reliable access to. The warmth is real because in the moment they are warm, they are fully warm. The care is real because in the moment they care, they genuinely care. The love, or what they call love, or what functions as love in those moments, is real in the same way. What isn't real is the continuity, the thread that runs through all of it and makes it something you can stand on. The thing that, when you say I need to tell you something and you're looking at me across a table, means I am here with the same self that drove 4 hours and sat with you in the waiting room and learned how your father needs to be listened to. That thread, Broderick may not have had it. Not because he was a bad person, Because he had never been asked to be the same person twice in a row in the presence of someone who was watching carefully. I can already see the comment someone is typing right now. This is just excusing his behavior. He knew what he was doing. He stayed for 14 months and then walked out. That's a choice. And that's not wrong. It's not wrong that he made choices. It's not wrong that Karina was affected by those choices in ways she didn't consent to. It's not wrong that the absence of malice doesn't mean the absence of harm. But here's what I'd push back on. The framework of knowing what he was doing assumes a coherent interiority that the evidence in this story doesn't clearly support. It assumes that somewhere inside him there was a self that understood what was real and selected a different presentation. And if that's true, if the deception was deliberate, then the story is terrible but comprehensible. What's harder to sit with is the possibility that he was not deceiving her, that he was exactly as present as he was capable of being, and that his capacity had a ceiling she couldn't see until she asked him to exceed it. The question Karina keeps returning to, and I want to be careful here, because this is the part she hasn't said out loud to anyone, is whether she knew. Not consciously, not in the way that would have changed her behavior, or that she could have named if someone had asked her directly in year one, but somewhere below the level of conscious thought, in the place where the things you notice but don't yet have language for accumulate. The half-beat in the laugh. The eye contact held slightly too long. The recession, specific, patterned, predictable, that happened every time the conversation turned toward her experience of the relationship rather than her experience of the world. She noticed all of it. She filed it. And she built a model of him that accounted for all of it as minor data, as texture, as personality, as the interesting complexity of a person she was still learning, rather than as a signal about the structural limits of what he was capable of. The question she is sitting with, the one that doesn't have a clean answer and that I don't think she will resolve entirely, is whether that filing was a failure of perception or a necessary act of faith. Whether the willingness to build a model of someone that accounts for the difficult data as texture rather than warning is what love requires, or whether it's what love costs. I don't know where you're watching this. Maybe it's late. Maybe you're supposed to be doing something else right now. But if you've made it this far, I think you already know why this story matters to you specifically. Because most of us have a version of this. Not the same version. Not the same person, the same ending, the same dining room in March. But a version where the thing that hurt most wasn't the thing that looked like the injury. Where the knife, when you finally saw it, was held by someone you had reason to trust with sharp things. And the question you've been sitting with ever since isn't whether they hurt you. You know they did, but whether they meant to. And whether that distinction changes anything. Here is what I think changed for Karina. And I want to be precise about this, because I think imprecision would do her experience a disservice. She did not conclude that the 14 months were a lie. She doesn't believe that. The evidence doesn't support it. And she is someone who follows evidence even when the conclusion is uncomfortable. She did not conclude that he was a bad person. She doesn't believe that either. Bad people are, in a specific way, easier. Bad people have a self that is oriented against you. What she encountered was something more troubling. A person whose self was oriented toward her, genuinely and in specific dimensions, and was simply not available in the dimension that mattered when the moment arrived. What she concluded, and this is still forming, still incomplete, still a conclusion she is in the process of arriving at, is that presence is not the same as love. That someone can be present with you, fully, genuinely, specifically present, in all the ways that feel like love, and still not be present in the way that love requires. The way that says, I am here with the same self in the difficult moment as in the easy one. I am here when what you need from me is not comfort, but accountability. I am here in the conversation that is about me and what I am not giving you, not just in the conversation that is about you and what you are carrying. Presence without that consistency is not a foundation. It is a room with one wall, warm enough while you're in it, completely open to the outside. Let me talk about the grief for a moment, because I think the shape of it matters. Karina grieved twice. The first grief was for him, for the relationship, for the specific texture of 14 months with a person who knew how to sit with her in the fog and drove 4 hours without being asked and made her father feel heard. That grief was painful and legible, and it moved through her the way grief is supposed to move. Not cleanly, not on a schedule, but with direction. It had somewhere it was going. The second grief was harder to locate because it didn't have an obvious object. She was grieving. She eventually understood the model. Not him. The model of him she'd built. The picture assembled from 14 months of specific, real, genuine data points that had produced a person she believed in. A person who, it turned out, didn't correspond to anything that existed continuously outside her perception of it. That grief is different in kind from the first one. The first one has an object that is real and lost. The second one has an object that was, in some sense, never exactly what she thought it was, which doesn't mean it was nothing, but means the loss is harder to hold, because you're not entirely sure what you're mourning. You're mourning a version of someone that they may have genuinely been, in the moments when they were it, and that simply ceased to exist in the space between those moments. How do you grieve something like that? 8 months out, here is where Karina is. She is not over it in the way that word suggests complete resolution. She doesn't think she'll be over it in that sense for a while. Maybe ever, in the way that over it implies the experience has no further claim on her. But she is through the part of it that was incapacitating. She has told each of her 2 friends a different half of the story, not out of deliberate compartmentalization, but because neither half is complete on its own, and she hasn't yet found the person she wants to give the whole thing to. She still thinks about the thanking her for dinner. Not with the same acuteness as in the first weeks. The detail doesn't stop her mid-task the way it did. But it's still there. Still unresolved. Still the thing she returns to when she's trying to understand what the evening was, in its entirety. Because the thanking her for dinner is, in the most compressed form, the whole problem. It means he was still himself. Still the person she knew. Still attending to the small gestures of care that other people miss. Even in the moment when he was dismantling everything. The care and the leaving were not separate things that happened in sequence. They were simultaneous. He thanked her for dinner and ended the relationship with the same impulse, from the same self, in the same breath. And she doesn't know what to do with that. I want to tell you about the knife metaphor. Not as a neat summary, but because I think it deserves more than the title gives it. A knife held by a stranger is not the same experience as a knife held by someone you trusted with sharp things. The stranger's knife is an assault. It produces fear, anger, the specific outrage of violation. It is an experience that the world around you recognizes and responds to. People understand what happened. They have language for it. They know how to sit with you in it. The other knife, the one held by someone you love, or someone you loved, or someone you still love even as they are holding it, is different in kind, not just in degree. Because you can't respond with outrage. Or you can, but it doesn't land right, because part of you is still trying to account for who they are to you. Still trying to hold both the harm and the history. Still trying to reconcile the person who drove 4 hours with the person who thanked you for dinner on the way out the door. The world around you has less language for this. The frameworks offer, he was never who you thought he was. Or, the relationship wasn't real. Or, you deserve better and you'll find it. All of which may be true in some sense. None of which answers the actual question. Which is, how do you understand what happened between 2 people when what happened was not simple, was not clean, was not organized around a villain doing something clearly wrong to a victim who didn't see it coming, but was instead 2 people in a room, one of whom was fully present and one of whom was present in all the ways except the one that turned out to matter most. And neither of them understood the difference until the moment it became undeniable. This is the channel that doesn't look away from the stories that resist resolution. Not because difficulty is interesting for its own sake, but because the stories that resist resolution are often the ones that are most true, and the ones that most of us actually live, even when we have no framework to describe them. If you're someone whose emotional intelligence is high enough to sit with the version of a story that is actually true, even when the true version is less satisfying than the clean one, you're in the right place. There's a question underneath everything I've described today that I haven't answered, that I can't answer, that Karina hasn't answered. Whether she knew, not consciously, we've established that, but in the accumulated place where the things you notice and file and interpret charitably eventually become a weight you've been carrying without naming it. Whether the faith she placed in her model of him was genuine faith, the kind that is a form of love, the kind that says I will not reduce you to the difficult data, I will hold all of you including the parts one don't yet understand. Or whether it was something closer to a choice she was making, below the level of awareness, not to see what the pattern was pointing toward. I don't think those 2 things are entirely separable. I think genuine love and strategic not seeing can occupy the same gesture. I think the willingness to file something under texture rather than warning can be, simultaneously, an act of generosity and an act of self-protection. And I think one of the most difficult things about a story like this, one of the things that makes the second grief harder than the first, is that you cannot determine afterward which it was, because the answer changes the meaning of the 14 months. If it was faith, she loved well and the architecture was sound, and the thing that failed was not her perception but the foundation she was building on. If it was strategic not seeing, she participated, somehow, in the conditions that made the ending possible, and the evidence supports both readings. I want to end somewhere specific, not with a resolution, not with the version of this story that tells you what to take away from it, what to do differently, what the lesson is. Because I don't think this story has a lesson in the way that implies the experience was a problem to be solved. Karina is not a cautionary tale. She is a person who loved carefully and fully and precisely and encountered something that her care was not equipped to protect her from. Not because she was careless, but because the thing she encountered was not the kind of thing that careful love can see coming. What I want to leave you with instead is a question, not a comfortable one. The question is, when you have encountered a version of this, when you have found yourself holding pain that doesn't have a clean narrative, that resists the templates, that exists in the space between real harm and real care, what did you do with the part that was real? Not the part that hurt, the part that was real. Because I think that's the part that matters most. And I think it's the part that gets most easily lost when we try to organize our experiences into stories that are legible, into stories with villains and victims and moments where everything becomes clear. The part that was real. Did you let yourself keep it? If this story landed somewhere specific for you, if there's a moment in it that you recognized from your own life, or a question it opened that you're still sitting with, I want to hear it. Not just the version where you agree with the reading I've offered, the version where you disagree, the version where your experience points somewhere different. Drop it below. I read everything. The next story on this channel goes somewhere that this one pointed at but couldn't fully address. About what happens after this kind of grief, not the resolution of it, but the way it changes what you're able to receive from the next person who tries to get close. About whether the second model you build is more accurate or just more defended. That story is right here when you're ready.